and welcome to this special 2024-25 NBA season preview edition of the Brett Chat Sport or BCS podcast. We're going to be covering both conferences and all 30 teams, while also hearing from a number of fans on how they think their team will do this season. And let's start with the defending champions, the Boston Celtics. The Celtics go into the new season having retained the vast majority of last season's roster. This means that they have continuity going into the new season, and they also now know how to win a championship too, which sets them up perfectly to retain their title. In terms of other contenders in the East, the Milwaukee Bucks have also retained the vast majority of their roster's core. Given that head coach Doc Rivers has now had the off-season to work with the team and has also added depth in the form of Taurean Prince and three-point specialist Gary Trent Jr., there are all the makings for the Bucks to be able to make another run for the NBA Finals and maybe even the championship again. The New York Knicks, meanwhile, are coming off a run to the Eastern Conference semi-finals last season and are now going to want to push on. To that end, the trade for Karl-Anthony Towns should be one that enhances the residents of Madison Square Garden, given that they now have two very different options at centre in Cat and Mitchell Robinson that they can deploy as needed depending upon the opposition. In Karl-Anthony Towns, they also continue to have a very good secondary scorer behind Jalen Brunson too. Add to that the addition of defensive stalwart Malik Bridges from the Nets, who also blossomed into a very good primary scorer himself while he was in Brooklyn, and all the makings of for the Knicks to be able to push on and maybe go one or two steps further this season. For more on this, let's head over to Long Island, New York to hear from Knicks fan and British expat Ross Worsley.
It's been quite a lot of changes in the off season for the Knicks. Quite a lot of movement on the player side. So I was quite happy to see that we were able to re-sign a couple of the big players like OG and Jalen Brunson, as well as adding Bridges and Karl-Anthony Towns. But I was quite upset to see a few of the guys from last season who were so impressive leaving, like DiVincenzo, Hartenstein, Randall. Randall did have his injury problems, so it could be, in the long run, a good choice to trade him out, and hopefully Towns can stay healthy, because I think he does matches up pretty well against some of the teams in the East, especially the Celtics. Last year was our first 50-win seasons for over 10 years, so it's quite a lot to live up to this season, but I think the squad overall has been improved by the signings, so I think we have a good chance to match that, and hopefully maybe we can get past the finals. I think last year the Game 7 loss was a bit of a killer, but this season hopefully we can go one step further.
When talking about strong rosters in the East, we also have to mention the Philadelphia 76ers, who frankly might have the strongest roster in the NBA now. In Paul George, Andre Drummond, Caleb Martin and Reggie Jackson and Eric Gordon, they've made some absolutely excellent additions in this off-season. And the expectation in Philly now has to be that the confetti will be raining down as Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey lift the Larry O'Brien Trophy in June. When considering the Miami Heat, it has to be said that the core of this roster is the same as the one that made the NBA Finals in 2023. I don't expect them to make the finals again, but given what head coach Eric Spoelstra has done with this roster before, it should come as no surprise if they do. The Indiana Pacers, meanwhile, gave a very good account of themselves as they made the Eastern Conference Finals last season. Having retained all of their key pieces while also adding some depth in the shape of James Wiseman at centre, you would expect them to make the playoffs again. I can't help but think that they are missing that extra bit of quality needed in order to be considered a serious contender though. Similarly, as much as they have a very strong roster led by Donovan Mitchell, I also think that the Cleveland Cavaliers don't quite have enough quality to be considered a serious contender as well. On this point, all of that fantastic young talent that the Orlando Magic have been drafting in the last few years finally started to perform well together last season as they made the playoffs. The vast majority of that roster has been retained this season, and they've also added the two-time champion Contavious Caldwell Pope to the mix, meaning that they should make the playoffs again this season. Meanwhile, over at the Barclays Centre, the Brooklyn Nets are expected to not do well this season. There is certainly talent on the roster, but it is very young talent that does not have a lot of experience of competing in the NBA. Another way of looking at it though is that the likes of Cam Thomas and Cameron Johnson now have a golden opportunity to step up and show the league what they are capable of, aided by the experience of guys like Dennis Schroeder and Bojan Bogdanovic. In terms of rosters that have a lot of young players that now have the opportunity to push on and show what they can do, there's also my team, the Chicago Bulls. Here's what Bulls fan and friend of the show Brandon Gries had to say following the draft in June.
The Bulls with just one pick in the two-round draft at number 11, and they picked up a local kid in 6'10" forward Matas Buzelis. He's a name that was not expected to still be available, so many feeling like Chicago might have got a top 10 quality player. Buzelis is of Lithuanian descent. Both his parents played professionally there before moving to the United States and then settling in the Chicago area. He attended Hinsdale Central High School but didn't play varsity basketball there in state due to the COVID pandemic. He attended two high-profile prep schools in the States before landing with G League Unite, a developmental team in the NBA system. Buzelis was a consensus five-star recruit out of high school in 2023, averaging 15 points per game his senior year against pretty tough competition before averaging 14 with G League Unite more recently this past season. That helped him earn a spot in the NBA All-Star Weekend's Rising Stars game back in February in Indianapolis. He's only 19 years old, but has a lot of experience, already playing competitively in Illinois, New Hampshire, Kansas, and Nevada. Now he'll return back home to Chicago to begin his NBA career.
When I look at this Bulls roster, what I see is, yes, a very young roster, but it is punctuated by the all-star capabilities of Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic. Yes, it is a young roster, and yes, it is a very guard-heavy roster, and we have not replaced the rim protection and rebounding abilities of Andre Drummond. If we can replace that, there is no reason why we can't be competitive though. The big question is, are we going to replace it though? And I have to say, I don't think we are. And so we may be in for a season where we don't do well. In a similar vein, the Detroit Pistons have been drafting some fantastic young players via the draft the last few years. And at some point they, much like the Orlando Magic last season, have got to start coalescing together, performing well, and making the playoffs. In the off-season, they have added experience in the form of Tobias Harris, Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Paul Reed. For all of the trolling and the abuse that Tobias Harris got while he was in Philly, he is a fantastic and very reliable player, and I fully expect that he's going to take an on-court leadership role. And if he can do that at the Pistons, maybe that could be the change that helps this team to come together and start performing well. If they don't make the playoffs this season, then I have to say there is something seriously wrong in the Motor City. In the same vein, the Toronto Raptors are a team who I thought should have done better last season. RJ Barrett is someone who can score a lot of points when he wants, and he's not even the star on this roster. That title goes to Scotty Barnes. Those two, aided by the likes of Emmanuel Quickley and Jakob Perkle, are the basis of a very good roster, and I would expect them to make the playoffs this season. If they don't, I would want to know why. The Atlanta Hawks, meanwhile, go into the new season having drafted Zachary Risache with the first pick in this year's draft, adding to what was already a very talented roster. I fully expect them to make the playoffs given all of the talent that is now on this roster going into the new season. Elsewhere in the East, there's the Washington Wizards. Here is what Wizards fan and friend of the show Nick Wright had to say following the Wizards drafting Alex Sarr with the second pick in this year's draft.
On draft day, we saw the Wizards trade Denny Avdia to Portland, a really well-liked player in DC, someone that's going to be on a great contract for the next few years, really coming into his prime right now. Excellent player, particularly an excellent role player on a contender. That is not what the Wizards are. The Wizards basically looked at it. We got 2 first-round picks, some seconds, and Brogdon coming back the other way, who I think we can flip possibly for a first at some point as well. So actually, there was a haul coming back to the Wizards, and I think ultimately you've got to be happy with that. So then we went into draft day, and actually I think consensus, we took the best player on the board. Alex Sarr, the big man from France, came in. We had the number 2 overall pick. Alex Sarr came in, going to be an elite defender in the NBA, something that the Wizards have been lacking for quite some time, and actually really exciting. There's potential both ways, both defensively, but also I think he could be quite an offensive force as well. I think the Wizards, he basically made it clear he wanted to come to them. I think with the Hawks, with the big men they have there was no guarantee that he was going to get proper minutes from the get-go, which he is going to get in Washington, and they're absolutely going to build around him and last year's also French first-round pick, Bilal Coulibaly. So room for optimism there. Really happy with that selection. I mentioned that trade for Denny Avdia going to Portland. That brought us back the 14th pick, and we used that on Carrington from Pittsburgh, a point guard. So we got our big man, we got a guard. Again, really excited by the potential there both ways. I think he's a great shooter already, but he looks like he's going to add a lot to that Wizards backcourt. And then finally, we had another first-round pick, 24. We traded up, got rid of pick 51 to trade back up, and Keyshawn George, who is a wing. Less optimistic, I guess, when you're getting to that back end of the first. It's a bit of a crapshoot and you don't know what you're going to get. But I think this was a great draft for the Wizards. They've finally kicked off the rebuild they've needed for ages. Bradley Beal went last year. John Wall went a couple of years ago. We're finally looking to rebuild from scratch and actually look to put a contender together in maybe 4 or 5 years' time.
On the Wizards, anyone who knows me knows that I cannot say enough good things about Jonas Valanciunas. For me, New Orleans' loss is the Wizards' gain, and given the talent that is already on the Wizards roster, along with the arrival of the much heralded Alex Sarr, the Wizards really are a team who now need to start making some noise and really competing in the East. Finally in the East, there's the Charlotte Hornets. They really haven't added much that could move the needle since last season's rather disappointing showing, and so I do not expect them to make the playoffs this season, and they may even end up being the worst team in the NBA this season in spite of all the talent they have on this roster, such as Brandon Miller and LaMelo Ball. Let's head over to the Western Conference now, and let's start with last season's defeated finalists, the Dallas Mavericks. The Mavs showed last season that they have everything needed to seriously contend. Given that they've now added Klay Thompson to the mix, I would fully expect them to continue seriously contending for the championship again this season. Meanwhile, the Minnesota Timberwolves gave a very good account of themselves last season, headed up by the emerging and developing talent of Anthony Edwards. He really is starting to progress now and is becoming not just the franchise's star, but one of the best players in the NBA, much like Kevin Garnett did for the Timberwolves 25 years ago. Given that they've now added Julius Randle, who for me is both an upgrade at the power forward position and an absolutely fantastic secondary scorer behind Ant-Man, there is every reason to believe that the Timberwolves could continue to keep pushing on and make serious noise towards becoming potentially champions this season, particularly given that in that trade with the Knicks, they've also added Dante DiVincenzo, and so continue to have a sharp shooting presence from beyond the arc. Having failed to defend their championship last season, the Denver Nuggets are going to want to make amends this season. They continue to have that core of the roster of Michael Porter Jr., Jamal Murray, and arguably the world's greatest player right now in Nikola Jokic. Given that they've now added the experience of Russell Westbrook, who knows what they could do. Westbrook isn't getting any younger, but he is still capable of posting a triple-double at times, and that can only help the Nuggets' chances going into the new season. Having entered last season's playoffs as the number 1 seed in the Western Conference, the Oklahoma City Thunder are going to want to push on this season. It has to be said that they have a very talented young roster, headed up by Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Chet Holmgren, who for me, as good as Victor Wembanyama was last season, I can't help but think that Holmgren maybe deserved to be co-rookie of the year with Wemby last season. Given that the Thunder have now added the experience and defensive capabilities of Alex Caruso and Isaiah Hartenstein in the off-season, they are doing everything they need to do to push on. I can't help but think that this roster is maybe still another year away from being able to seriously contend for the championship though. Finally, in terms of teams I think are championship contenders in the West, it has to be said that the Los Angeles Clippers continue to have a wonderful roster. I have honestly been surprised that they have not put more of a fight up in the last few seasons for the championship, given just how talented their roster has been. But given that they're now going to be moving into their new home, the Inuit Dome this season, they're going to want to push on and finally bring that championship home, christening that new home of theirs. It's surely now or never for the Phoenix Suns. The expectation last season was that the combination of Kevin Durant, Devin Booker and Bradley Beal was going to make them serious championship contenders, but that did not come to pass. In this off-season though, they have added some good depth in the form of Mason Plumlee and Monte Morris, and so they are setting themselves up to have another good run at that championship. And if it doesn't happen this year, I would not be surprised if this roster then is broken up and they start to rebuild for another run at some point in the future. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Lakers are also going to try to make a push. I don't think they could make a serious push. There is a good roster there, headed up by LeBron James, but the elephant in the room when it comes to the Lakers is that they've drafted LeBron's son Bronny, who by any objective measure is not someone who should have been getting drafted this year. For more on this, let's head over to friend of the show and former LA resident Freddie Law-Keen.
Now, the team coming into this year is going to look pretty similar. Some notable minutes men departures were Taurean Prince and Spencer Dinwiddie, who's left. Cam Reddish is staying long, Max Christie staying, but you're going to have your starting five of D'Angelo Russell, Austin Hayes, Rui Hachimura, LeBron James, and of course Anthony Davis. So that team is going to be pretty stable, and to see how many minutes we get out of those five is probably going to determine the outcome of this season. Probably the most interesting incoming of this year is actually the person who's living all of our dreams. Professional podcaster, professional media man, turned head coach, JJ Redick. The Lakers have gone with the Rams model, and the Arsenal model looking for a younger coach, more someone who has a good relationship with the players, and seeing what they can do. So, pretty untested. I think he'll have a pretty long leash, as Darvin Ham had a relatively long leash. He stayed in there longer than I think anyone thought he would. The margin of success will be on how the depth players play, because we all know every year everyone gets a little bit older, but it feels like LeBron gets older every year, and you start to see that damage on his joints, and every year he defies those odds. But Might this be the year it all catches him? My guess is no, but it certainly could. If there's any unanswered questions going into this year, it would probably be how long a leash does the Bronny James experiment have? Obviously, LeBron has signed another 2-year extension and has said he'll be retiring after he plays with his son. And LeBron pretty much gets whatever he wants in life. So good for him. He's got another one of his dreams and he gets to play with his son. If I had to say, I think the floor of this team is probably 40 wins, probably gets you a playing spot, and the ceiling of this team is probably 50 wins.
The Sacramento Kings improved their roster no end with the addition of DeMar DeRozan in the offseason. I don't know if the addition of Devo will put them over the top and make them serious championship contenders, but they certainly got the better end of the deal in the trade with the Bulls. Down in San Francisco, meanwhile, the Golden State Warriors are in a state of flux for me. They still have the transcendent talent of Steph Curry, but Klay Thompson is now gone, and Draymond Green's talents are now not only on the wane, but I would say he's also starting to become a distraction to the team given his multiple suspensions and antics, shall we say. They do have a fantastic coach in Steve Kerr and have added some fantastic depth to the roster in the form of Kyle Anderson and De'Anthony Melton, as well as adding Boogie Hill to be a direct replacement for Klay Thompson. I don't see them making the finals this year or winning the championship, but I do expect them to make the playoffs at least. The Memphis Grizzlies, meanwhile, should do better this season, given that Ja Morant is back, having missed the majority of last season, first through suspension and then through injury. They've added to the roster this season with the addition of the 7'4" rookie centre, Zach Edey, and he, along with Morant, Marcus Smart, Triple J, Jaren Jackson Jr. and Desmond Bain, should form a very solid starting five, along with the depth that they have on this roster too. I don't see them as a championship contender, but they should make the playoffs, and there's no reason not to believe that they can make some real noise in the postseason. Down in New Orleans, the Pelicans have reshaped their roster by bringing in DeJounte Murray via a trade with the Hawks. For me, he now has the opportunity to show up and show out in New Orleans in a backcourt where his partner, CJ McCollum, for all of his talent, has always been willing to defer the spotlight for the good of the team. I am, however, slightly worried by reports that head coach Willie Green intends to start 6'7" forward Herb Jones as his centre. Given that the NBA is now a league where teams are starting multiple bigs, I seriously wonder how Green expects his teams to compete in the paint. The Portland Trailblazers have not been living up to their name in recent seasons. They certainly have a very good, young, talented roster, and I'll be interested to see how first-round draft pick centre Donovan Clingan does this season, although I would expect that he'll be playing behind DeAndre Ayton in that centre position. Otherwise, I don't think any of their additions will move the needle. Denny Avdia and Devontae Graham are both talented players, but they aren't, for me, players that are going to put this roster in any kind of higher echelon than what they were already competing, and so I do not see them making the playoffs again this season. The Utah Jazz, meanwhile, do have a very good roster that is primed to compete in today's NBA. There is a good blend of depth, talent and experience there, with a front court that features Lauri Markkanen, John Collins, Walker Kessler and Drew Eubanks, as well as a backcourt that features Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, Keontae George and Patty Mills. As such, I fully expect this roster to push on and make the playoffs this season. Moving on to the San Antonio Spurs now, and for me, Chris Paul could be the best thing that ever happens to Victor Wembanyama and the rest of the Spurs' talented young roster. CP3 is now entering his 20th NBA season and has a lot of wisdom to impart. In particular, the Spurs' young point guards, Trey Jones and recent draftee Stephon Castle, could stand to learn a lot from the point guard on a daily basis. It might not mean the Spurs making the playoffs this season, but it should certainly set up this roster for lots of good things in years to come. Finally in the West, the Houston Rockets go into the new season as the Western Conference version of the Detroit Pistons for me. There is some fantastic young talent there in Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun, and they've got a tough veteran centre in Steven Adams, as well as a very talented point guard in Fred VanVleet, adding experience and knowledge to the mix. They might not make the playoffs this season, but at some point this Rockets roster has got to start coalescing and consistently performing better than it has been in recent seasons. It should be a really good season then, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all plays out. Also, don't forget that at some point this season we should expect to see the announcement of 2 expansion teams. Given that one of these is expected to be based in Las Vegas, expect that announcement to be made during the finals of the NBA Cup, with the other team expected to be based in Seattle. As someone who grew up in the 90s watching the Supersonics, I certainly hope that that second team will be a reincarnation of the Seattle Supersonics. Given that that would mean adding 2 new teams to the Western Conference, one existing Western Conference team would have to move over to the East to balance up the 2 conferences. Given that they are the original incarnation of the Charlotte Hornets, I fully expect that the New Orleans Pelicans will be that team that will be moved over, and we should expect that announcement during this season as well. Let's end though by going back to a couple of our contributors to see who they think will win the NBA Finals this season.
That would be my pick to win it all, would probably be the Celtics again, to be honest, just because they have kept that team together and it was an exceptional team last year.
My tip to win this year is, I think, the Dallas Mavericks. Even though I said the West isn't going to win too much, I have a feeling about the Dallas Mavericks. I think they'll be good this year.
Once again, thank you to everyone who contributed to this episode. For now though, that is the end of this special 2024-25 NBA season preview edition of the BCS podcast. As always, I thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye now. The BCS podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Boris Anderoff and Pixabay for the use of the music and sound effects in this podcast. This episode features contributions from Brandon Gries, Freddie Law-Keen, Ross Worsley and Nick Wright.